Hello and welcome back to my series on the Old Testament and the surrounding world. This is part 2 on Egypt, and in this class I'm going to talk about the New Kingdom period and take you all the way down to the end of the ancient Egyptian civilization. If you watched the first Egyptian video, you know that we ended it during the second intermediate period known as the Hyksos dynasty, where Egypt was ruled by foreign pharaohs. At the end of the Hyksos dynasty, it marked a radical change in Egyptian society. Scholars believe, and enough of them do that I thought it deserved being mentioned, that as a reaction to the Hyksos rule, Egypt becomes more xenophobic. Whatever foreigners they did not kill or expel, they enslaved. This would fit with the biblical narrative of the Hebrew enslavement in Egypt. But again, this hasn't been proven. This is just largely a consensus believed by scholars. So on into the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom starts around 1539 BC and lasts till around 1075 BC. At this point in time, all the tombs on the Giza plain had been looted by the pharaohs. So the pharaohs started building in the Valley of the Kings. This New Kingdom period is the time period that my favorite pharaoh, Hatshepsut, lived. And she lived around 1507 BC to around 1458 BC. A famous pharaoh during the New Kingdom period, or infamous, depending on what you think, his name was Akhenaten. He lived either in 1336 or 1334 BC, and he was the grandfather or the father, it's unclear, of King Tutankhamun, commonly known as King Tut. He was infamous in Egyptian history because he changed Egyptians' religion from many gods to the belief of one god. His names and deeds were almost lost to history after his death because of his changing the religious structure of Egypt. His queen is the famous Queen Nefertiti. It's hard to get to know the real person behind that famous statue of Nefertiti, but what we do know is she was the principal queen of the pharaoh Akhenaten. We know that she had 6 daughters. What we don't know is who her parents were, and there's so many other mysteries surrounding Nefertiti, it's hard to get any semblance at all of a real person. A couple other famous pharaohs from the New Kingdom period, who most everybody has heard of, are of course King Tut, who lived from 1342 BC to around 1325 BC. And he had such a short reign, but he is only famous because his tomb in the Valley of the Kings was found intact. It wasn't robbed. The other famous pharaoh from the New Kingdom period was the pharaoh Ramses II, aka Ramses the Great, or Ramses the Builder. He built all kinds of monumental structures all around Egypt. He had the second longest reign in Egyptian history at 66 years on the throne. And in the New Kingdom period, the Exodus is believed to have happened during this time period of Egyptian history. The problem is that even Jewish scholars can't agree about when it occurred. I've researched long and hard into it and have come to my own personal conclusion that this 500-year time period of history is as close as I care to call it. There are several compelling arguments for a couple different pharaohs during this time period, and all of them being the pharaoh from Exodus. And the arguments are so compelling that you can read one of them and then go and think that that has to be the pharaoh, and then go on and read another argument about it, and that sounds just as legitimate. Going by what we can prove over what we believe, this time period is after the chariot came into use, and Exodus talks about chariots being used to chase the Hebrews out of Egypt. Based on 1 Kings, The Exodus was 480 years before the building of the first temple during the reign of Solomon. And that would put Exodus in the middle of the 18th dynasty, roughly in this time period of 1570 BC to 1293 BC. There is no reference to the Exodus in Egyptian history, but that's not surprising since the Egyptians never recorded defeats. So, as much as it might seem like a cop-out, the Jews have been arguing about Exodus dates since before Christianity existed. I've read too many arguments for high Exodus dates versus low Exodus dates to be convinced any better than this 500-year period of time. One last Exodus-related bit of information that the Egyptians can help us with is that Moses is an Egyptian name. It has to do with birth, but in Hebrew the name draws its meaning from water. It means being drawn from water. For example, Tutmos in Egyptian means born of Thoth. Amos means born of the moon god. There are other mentions in Egyptian history that can help us place the Israelites in the Promised Land at a given time in history. The best one is called the Israeli stele. A stele is a stone or wooden slab. Generally, it's taller than it is wide, and this was erected in the ancient world as a monument. The surface of the stele often has text, ornamentation, or both. The Israeli stele, which you see now, was made by Merneptah, the 13th son of Ramses II. He became pharaoh after his father died, and it describes victories over a group of people called the Sea People, roughly around 1200 BC. On the Israeli stele, it mentions an Egyptian campaign in Canaan, and it mentions the name Israel. Disputes over whether it describes Israel as a nation or as a tribal group of people do exist, but it would be important for dating the Israelites on whether they were still wandering or if they were settled by then. Nobody agrees, but they are there in history and they are mentioned around 1200 BC. Israel is also mentioned by name in three different 9th century BC artifacts: the Mesha stele, the Tel Dan stele, and the Kerr monument, but the 9th century is still 400 years after the dating of the Merneptah stele. The most interesting pharaoh, in my opinion, in Egyptian history is one named Hatshepsut. My interest in her started with a photo, and I'll share that photo in a bit here, but the more I learned about her, the more impressed I became. Hatshepsut, she lived around 1507 BC and died roughly around 1458 BC. Hatshepsut's parents were Thutmose I and his wife Amos. Thutmose I talked about before. He was well known for expelling the Hyksos pharaohs and for his military conquests, expanding the Egyptian empire further than it had ever gone before him. He was also the first confirmed pharaoh to have a tomb set up for himself in the Valley of the Kings. Thutmose had no sons with Amos. She was his great queen, but he had other lesser queens and concubines. And when he died, Hatshepsut was married at the age of 12 to her half-brother who took the ruling name of Thutmose II. Thutmose II reigned for 13 years with Hatshepsut as his queen, and when he died, she ruled as regent for their son, Thutmose III. He was too young to rule. After several years, and the numbers are conflicting between them being 7 years to 13 years ruling as regent, she declared herself king, aka a pharaoh. Hatshepsut never once tried to kill or disinherit her stepson, Thutmose III. In fact, as he got older, he ended up commanding all of her armies during her reign as pharaoh. Hatshepsut is known as the first great woman in history of whom we are informed. She reigned as pharaoh during the 15th century BC, and her reign has been determined to have lasted more than 20 years. That makes her the longest reigning female ruler in the entire history of ancient Egypt. It's worth pointing out that Hatshepsut was not, in fact, the first female pharaoh of Egypt. There were at least 2 other female monarchs before her. Her reign was said to have been far more peaceful than any other pharaoh's time on the throne in Egypt. Her reign had several big trading expeditions specifically noted, one being to the land of Punt. Punt had not been found yet, but it is believed to have been in the area of Eritrea on the western coast of sub-Saharan Africa, and they believe that from the descriptions of what was traded for and brought back to Egypt. Artwork in one of Hatshepsut's temples does indicate an early military campaign during her reign as pharaoh. It was reportedly fought between Egypt and Numidia, and it resulted in a decisive victory for Egypt. But remember, the Egyptians didn't leave any records of defeats, only decisive victories. Statues of Hatshepsut sometimes have her wearing the same beard that other pharaohs wore. If you look closely at the statues of pharaohs, there's often a thin line showing a chin strap used to attach the fake beard that the pharaohs all wore during ceremonial functions. One of the finest architectural wonders of ancient Egyptian timeline was built during Hatshepsut's reign and is named after her. The mortuary temple of Hatshepsut stands near the Valley of the Kings on the west bank of the Nile. It served not only as a grand tribute to her, but it was also a place for active worship of the gods that were important to her. The walls of the mortuary temple complex show pictures of her life story, but all mentions of her name have been chiseled off and replaced with the names of her father, her husband, and her son, Thutmose I, II, and III. Theories abound on who did this and why, but we do not know for sure. The obelisk of Queen Hatshepsut in the Karnak temple complex outside of Luxor, Egypt, is the largest obelisk in the whole temple complex. It weighs 328 tons and stands just over 95 feet tall. Later in her reign, she ordered the construction of 2 more obelisks to commemorate her 16th year on the throne. One of the obelisks that she ordered built broke during the construction process. Thus, the 3rd one was ordered to be built to replace it. The broken obelisk is left in the ground at the quarrying site in Aswan, Egypt, and it remains there to this day. It's known as the unfinished obelisk, and it provides evidence on how the obelisks were constructed and quarried in ancient times. The ancient Egyptians carved their obelisks from a single block of stone, almost always red granite. This type of rock is most notably found in Aswan in the southern part of Egypt. In the granite quarries of Aswan, the obelisks would be carved out of the bedrock and then transported on the waters of the Nile to their destinations where they would be erected. Hatshepsut's temple has a wall painting showing 2 barges being used to transport her obelisk downriver to the Karnak complex. At some point in time during the construction, the workers discovered cracks in the stone of this unfinished obelisk, and therefore they have decided to abandon the job. The unfinished obelisk has remained where it was ever since, and had it been completed, it would have had a height of 138 feet tall and would have weighed in at 1,323 tons, which would have made it the largest obelisk created by the ancient Egyptians. Hatshepsut left many lasting monuments, temples, and other buildings scattered throughout Egypt. As impressive as she was in life, her death also has a very cool twist. In 1891, archaeologists discovered this canopic box at a dig site in the Valley of the Kings. It contained an embalmed liver, an embalmed stomach, and a single human tooth. The canopic box and the jar that contained the tooth and the stomach was inscribed with the pharaoh Hatshepsut's name. For a long time, these were her only supposed remains. In 1903, a looted tomb in the Valley of the Kings was discovered by archaeologist Howard Carter. You may recognize his name. He was made famous for discovering King Tut's tomb. The tomb that Carter discovered was the longest tomb in the Valley of the King, and it contained the name of the pharaoh Hatshepsut. Inside this tomb, laying on the floor, were the mummified remains of two women. Then in 2007, a new examination of both mummies revealed that one of them was missing a tooth. Remember that canopic box I mentioned? That its single tooth was a match in the mummy's mouth, and this proved that the mummy was indeed Hatshepsut's. The precise date of Hatshepsut's death is known from a funeral stele that was erected for her. It shows that in year 22, month 11, and day 10 of her reign, she died. Egyptologists have translated that date to be around the 16th of January, 1458 BC. Since calendars have since gone through multiple changes throughout our history, this is just an estimated guess. So don't set your time machines to go back to that date, because odds are you'd probably still miss her funeral. I said earlier that my interest with Hatshepsut started with a photo of her, and this is it. I had a long career in forensic medicine, and I had never seen a smiling corpse before, let alone one from a person that died 3,500 years ago. Hatshepsut died around 50 years old after a long, successful, and peaceful reign. I would say rest in peace, but from her smile, it looks like she's been that way for a very long time. So mummification. If you ask anybody to name anything at all about ancient Egypt, odds are they're going to say something either about the pyramids or mummies. Since I think the subject of mummification is kind of required to talk about in any Egyptian class, I'm going to tell you a bit about mummification. Mummies have been discovered all the way back to the Old Kingdom period. Mummies from the Old Kingdom period are characterized by the heavy use of plaster-soaked linen. Remember, this is the time of the pyramid burials for the pharaohs. This period also marks the first attempt at artificial mummification or embalming or preserving the dead in world history. In these times, there was no organ removal. They just wrapped the body in plaster and called it good. These mummies are more like a plaster-covered human statue with remains inside of them. Moving on into the Middle Kingdom period, this is the mummy of the chief treasurer, Akhotep, who lived somewhere around 1981 BC to around 1802 BC, and it was found inside of a regular coffin. Likely, this is the style used during the times of the Hebrew patriarchs. Organ removal took place at this time. The brains were tossed out. They were thought that they weren't important. The heart was left in place inside the body, but the lungs, stomach, liver, and kidneys were pulled out and kept in separate canopic jars or canopic boxes. The bodies were then dehydrated with natron, which is a mixture. It's a natural mixture of a salt and a baking soda like powder. After the body was dehydrated for 35 days, it was stuffed with frankincense in the head and myrrh in the abdominal cavity. In antiquity, there were guilds of embalmers, and they were called men of Anubis. Anubis was the Egyptian god of the dead. Everybody in ancient Egyptian history had a funeral or burial, from the greatest pharaoh to the common folk. When your loved ones died, you would go to the embalmers guild, look at models of different kinds of embalming, and then the different prices for each different style of embalming. Then you had 5 days to mourn the dead at your home. You would take the body to the embalmer's shop, also known as the place of cleansing, and after the body dehydrated for 35 days, the process would be complete. Mourning then continued until the body was ready for the tomb 70 days after death. From the Middle Kingdom onward, the Middle Kingdom period onward, mummies had toe tags on them underneath the bandages for identification. Since the process of embalming and mummification was done in city shops, the Middle Kingdom period devised a way to make sure the bodies didn't get mixed up. Medical examiner facilities around the U.S. today still use toe tags upon bodies when they arrive at the medical examiner facilities. In the New Kingdom period, this is showing the unwrapped body of Ramses the Great. Microscopic inspection of the roots of Ramses the Great's hair proved that his hair color was originally red. This ancient pharaoh died in his lower to mid-90s, which was quite old for those days. The year of his death was around 1213 BC, and his tomb was discovered in the Valley of the Kings in 1881. At this point, I want to encourage you, next time you read the Bible, to look at it as a history text, because there's so much more you can glean from it looking at it that way. I'm sure most of you have read the book of Genesis, but it might amaze you to know that 2 of the Hebrew patriarchs were mummified, and I'll show this to you in a minute. Here's the book of Genesis, and it shows us Israel, Joseph's father, who dies in Egypt, but he wanted to be buried in the land his family was from. Joseph, being a vizier of the Pharaoh's court, had his physicians embalm his father in the Egyptian way. The text gives us another historical hint at the time it could have happened. It specifically says chariots when it's talking about traveling up into Canaan to bury Israel, and this lends evidence towards the Hyksos period of Egyptian rule or later. This quote from Genesis shows that when Joseph died, he was mummified, and he ends up having an Egyptian burial. With the time period, who knows if or when we will ever discover the body, the mummified body of this Hebrew patriarch. I kind of hope that this encourages you to look at the Bible in a different way. Most of us have read through Genesis before and have just read right on by the fact that these 2 patriarchs of Hebrew history were actually Egyptian mummies. So look at the Bible a different way. It's not just about our historical beliefs. It can also be read as a historical record. But now we're going to press on down the Egyptian timeline. After the New Kingdom period, there comes a third intermediate period. Remember, the intermediate periods have little to no central authority, but this period of time is known as the Nubian period, or the time of the Black Pharaohs. This period runs from 1075 BC all the way down to 715 BC. After the period of Nubian rule, Egypt was taken over by the Persians. The Persians rule from about 715 BC to down to 332 BC. Egypt still had pharaohs during this time, and was self-ruled, but it was governed as a Persian subject state. So, the long 3,000-year history of the ancient Egyptian civilization ends with the Ptolemaic period. Ptolemaic, or Greek rule of Egypt, begins with Alexander the Great. Alexander rose to power following the death of his father, Philip of Macedon. After Alexander beat the Persian ruler Darius III, he went on down into Egypt, where the Egyptians ended up welcoming him as a liberator. Alexander the Great took his time in Egypt and laid out the plans for the city of Alexandria in the Nile Delta, but he also named cities Alexandria everywhere he conquered in his empire. Following Alexander the Great's death in the year 323 BC, his empire broke up into 4 pieces. His close friend and general Ptolemy I took Egypt for his portion of the empire. Ptolemy's family line ruled as pharaohs until Cleopatra and Mark Antony died during the Roman Civil War with Octavian, who was Julius Caesar's heir. Octavian went on to become the first emperor of Rome and took the name Caesar Augustus. Alexander the Great was entombed in Alexandria, Egypt. Pompey the Great, Julius Caesar, Augustus Caesar, they all visited Alexander the Great's tomb in Alexandria. They all wrote about their visits to the tomb. The Roman Emperor Caligula, who ruled 37 AD to 41 AD, he was said to have gone and taken Alexander the Great's breastplate from his tomb for his own personal use. Around 200 AD, the Emperor Septimus Severus closed Alexander's tomb to the public. His son and successor, Caracalla, he was a great admirer of Alexander the Great, and he visited the tomb during his reign. After this, we lose details of the tomb's fate. It's just lost to history now. Alexander the Great was a believer in the Greek gods. He spread their worship by building temples across his empire. He spread Greek culture, Greek philosophy, Greek architecture, and he built cities named after himself across of his empire. But the most important thing that Alexander the Great spread was the Greek language and writing across his empire. Greek was the language that the apostles used to reach people. In my opinion, and I state this flat out as my opinion over fact, is that Alexander the Great, who was a pagan, was a huge help in the spread of Christianity by speaking the Greek language and spreading the Greek language across the known world at the time. That's just something to ponder. So, how do scholars know all they know about ancient Egypt? The simple answer is the Rosetta Stone. Beginning with the conquest of Alexander the Great in 323 BC, Greek was the language of the governing elite in ancient Egypt. Those Greek rulers could neither speak the language of the people or read hieroglyphics, and this fueled resentment amongst the population. By Ptolemy V's reign in 205 BC, it's recorded that the country was in open revolt, and the Rosetta Stone was one stone of many that Ptolemy commissioned as a piece of political propaganda, and that was commissioned in 196 BC to publicly state his claim to be the rightful pharaoh of Egypt. The Rosetta Stone was discovered by a French captain named Pierre Bouchard in 1799 AD during the Napoleonic Wars. Captain Bouchard was supervising the restoration of a fort near the town of Rosetta when he found a block of basalt 3 foot 9 inches high, 2 foot 4 inches wide, and it was inscribed with 3 different types of writing. The Rosetta Stone is written in two languages, Egyptian and Greek, but it's written with three different writing systems: hieroglyphics, Demotic, and Greek. The Greek writing hadn't changed too much in the intervening years, but the hieroglyphics and the Demotic couldn't be translated. Without the Rosetta Stone, and being able to take the message written in ancient Greek and being therefore able to translate it into Demotic, which is just cursive writing in Egyptian, and hieroglyphics, which was used all the way back through antiquity, we wouldn't know most of the ancient Egyptians' 3,000-year history. I hope you enjoyed this message, this program, and join me next time. I'm going to do a video on the Hittite civilization, and please come back. Thanks.